So there's no one. We can begin. Okay. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Julia Fest, and I'm going to present today mindfulness in schools. Just a moment. Okay. So just a little bit about myself. I have a background in environmental engineering, after which I certified in Montessori educator and then mindful self-compassion for teenagers and young adults. I'm also a certified mindfulness coach by ICF and BMC Academy. I also train in nonviolent communication, and I'm on the path to certification, and I currently work as the head of mindfulness at UWC Thailand. So today together, we're going to explore why mindfulness in schools, adapting to the changing climates. I will go through some case studies since 2016, and then we will talk about mindfulness-informed coaching for staff in schools. So first of all, why mindfulness in schools? So this is a graphic representing the number of research articles and reviews on mindfulness. So as you can see, it has grown exponentially. There are more than 2,500 articles and reviews every year since 2020. And all those research shows how much mindfulness can benefit adults and youth alike, and in particular in schools, students and teachers, regarding their well-being, their resiliency, their emotional regulation, capacity for compassion, empathy, perspective taking, social skills, and also regarding their mental health, reduction regarding their stress, anxiety, burnout, depression. And it also helps with cognitive functions such as focus and concentration. And there's a huge body of evidence on how mindfulness also help for all sort of mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So the research is promising regarding mindfulness for youth, but there is a gray area regarding the benefits of mindfulness-based interventions in schools. So there is a difference between teaching mindfulness to youth who join a program, specific program, and trying to implement mindfulness in schools, and we'll see why. So first of all, let's see what types of mindfulness-based intervention in schools exist. So mostly standalone mindfulness courses. So maybe it's an external trainer, or it's someone who works already at the school, who got a training and who will teach, for example, an 8 weeks MBSR program, or it can be the Mind Up program or Mindful Schools program or .B that has a certain duration, a few weeks, and that will be it. Another type of mindfulness-based intervention is to train the teachers with the hope that the teachers will cultivate their mindfulness practice and will transfer their skills in the way they teach their students, and perhaps even pursue the capacity to teach mindfulness to their students. Then another type is curriculum-based programs. So that will be when mindfulness is integrated in the other topics, such as biology, math, history, and it's seemingly integrated in the curriculum. And then many less schools choose to go with a school-wide approach. And so a school-wide approach will mean that mindfulness is not only taught to students, to staff, to leaders, but that means that teachers and leaders transfer their mindfulness practice into their role. So they teach mindfully, they lead mindfully, and it's also part of the way the school approach their policy, decision making, the structure, and the system. So it's a mindfulness on the systemic level. And so all those approaches come, all those approaches come with some challenges. So if we start with the standalone mindfulness courses, it really depends on how the quality of the teaching, number one, and also if it's an external person, there's a need to create an immediate connection and to make it really relevant to the student situation, which is not really easy. When the programs focus on the teachers, then it's a bet that teachers will be able to transfer their mindfulness skills into their teaching. And then for the curriculum-based program, again, it depends on how effectively teachers incorporate the practices into their teaching. And for the school-wide approach, it's even obviously more complex. And again, about transferring the skills, it depends how leaders really apply the skills in their leadership. So there's a sound that started on my side, so sorry for that. I don't know if you're hearing anything. Okay. So why do you want to bring mindfulness in your school? I would like for you to take a moment and reflect on that. Or why do you want to bring, or why would you want to see mindfulness in schools if you don't work at a school? And I would like for you to write in the chat, please. Why would you want to see mindfulness in perhaps the school of your child? If you work in a school, why do you want mindfulness in your school? Just taking a moment for reflection and writing your responses in the chat. So I read healthier work, learning environments. So I understand that it will be both for students and staff. I read less pressure. Okay, stress management. It will be helpful if someone can guide the students not based on the performance or of score. I believe every organization needs mindfulness-based approach. Seeing schools implement it gives me hope that the leadership of the future is developing in a good direction. Okay, so schools as one type of organizations. Okay, thank you for your answers. So I'll share about my why. My why is I really want to see more wisdom and compassion in the field of education. Wisdom meaning awareness, self-awareness. When I think about teachers, I worked as a teacher. I've taught many different subjects in science in particular. The impact that we have as an adult on our student beyond the topic that we teach is huge, so huge that it's so important to have that awareness. And on a more wider level among colleagues and all the awareness around power differential, how leaders affect people they lead, how colleagues impact each other, and all those invisible dynamics and patterns and ego that comes out in the workplace in general. And so putting more awareness and capacity to see all of that, to name it, so we can actually change it. And to do that with compassion and kindness, because that's just us, humans. We are not bad, we're just unconscious. And so we need compassion to bring consciousness to the way we behave and we impact each other. And I love working with youth. I love their capacity to take something and do it their own, and their openness, even though we will talk perhaps about it, but for teenagers, there's often some resistance to how mindfulness is brought to them. But once they get that, they get it, once they see the value, um, it's amazing how they take it and how they very quickly they take it for themselves. So I love that, their capacity to see things and to own things. So adapting to the changing climate. We just went through the COVID pandemic, but really among youth, the real crisis is an isolation crisis. It's more and more clear that, especially with social media, with technology, our youth are just really losing the capacity to have um, social connections. And because on social media, it's really easy to find, um, with the algorithm to be confirmed in our view, there's this polarization that happens all around the world. And so I worked I worked, as I mentioned it, as the head of mindfulness at a school that is called UWC. It's part of a movement called United World College. And it was created in the 60s after the Second World War, with the idea that if you take two young students from two different parts of the world and they are roommates and they do very fun stuff like hiking and do outdoor education together and leadership program, they will understand each other and they will be friends and they can help solve the problems in the world, which is an amazing idea, except that you just think about it now, having a phone and having social media where those algorithms are just reinforcing your view. You can easily have two people in the same room not talking to each other and just um, emphasizing what they already think and not having any capacity to actually empathize and have compassion with each other view. The school's environment is more and more competitive, especially for the international schools. The school where I work is an IB school. It's a very smart program, but at the same time very demanding, especially the MYP and the DP program. We see with AI, ChatGPT has all the answers, and there is a lack of meaning of why should I learn those things at school? Why should I use my brain to, to think through, to write essays, to calculate, to come up with formulas when ChatGPT can do it? And the future not so bright. There's a lot of eco-anxiety, a lot of, wars are happening, and it seems that we want our youth to solve the problems and we want to equip them with the right tools, but we have the tools and we haven't solved anything. So it feels heavy. There is some heaviness in our young people. So, and from my perspective as well, there is a sense of urgency, a need for a quantum leap, especially when it comes to mindfulness. It's needed more than ever, but we need to adapt our mindfulness-based intervention. We cannot just go with our 8 weeks program and wait for things to unfold and be in the non-striving state and wait for the whole community to adapt it. So then eventually it will reach out the heart of blah, blah, blah. We need to be very flexible and very creative on how we bring mindfulness in schools. So I moved to some case studies since I started teaching mindfulness in schools since 2016. So I've been training teachers here. I was in Beijing, mostly in Montessori schools. On the left side, I was hired as a Montessori educator in the La Maison Montessori de Pékin. It's the only French-Chinese bilingual Montessori school in Beijing. So I was an internal NVC trainer in addition to being an educator, and I trained the team. And on the right side, I was at Heart and Mind Montessori Education Center, where I taught about 50 teachers NVC. So NVC is nonviolent communication, also called mindful communication, as an external trainer. So there are differences between being an internal trainer and external trainer. As an internal trainer, you get to see the evolution of your program. You get to be able to adapt, to talk to people, to have real daily life data. At the same time, you are also, because you are part of the structure, you also have to manage your own relationships. And sometimes being that mindful person also has its own challenges. And there is one big trap, that is thinking that you have to be that perfect Zen master, which you're not, because if you were, you will not be working in that school. You will probably be in a mindfulness center or in a Buddhist monastery. So each has their challenges. What I learned also when I taught nonviolent communication in this school on the left, I learned that there's a difference on how I perceive mindfulness and mindful communication and what the school was expecting. And so that was really my beginnings. And I just went with what I wanted to do. Just to realize down the road, 10 weeks after I started the program, that it was really not what they had in mind. And so what I learned is to really ask questions on what is needed. What does the school has in mind, and what do they really want? And then students training. So again, on the left side, that's Dalida, the founder of BMC Academy, and myself. So we were external trainers for, and we had a third colleague who is not on the photo, Charlene. She's on the call now. Hi, Charlene. So we were, our intervention was at the Keystone Academy School. We taught about 400 students over about 3 months. Some pieces of mindfulness and mindful self-compassion and pieces of nonviolent communication as well. And on the right side, that's the French high school in Beijing. I worked as a biology teacher, a math teacher for grade 7 to grade 10. And this is a group of grade 10 that I had in my biology class as a teacher. And you see another teacher on that photo, she's their theater teacher. And so this is an example where I was not hired as a mindfulness teacher, but I found a colleague who really resonated with what I had to offer, and we partnered. And so she was teaching my students theater, and she had them 3 hours a week. So we split for 8 weeks. I taught the Mindful Self-Compassion for Teenagers program. And so I was teaching 1.5 hours at the end of her class. And I will see this group of 12 students in my biology class and in their theater class, and teaching them mindfulness compassion. And the connection is completely different. Like, to the point that when I was teaching biology and one morning they looked so tired, and I asked them, okay, you look really tired, what should we do? And one said, could we have a meditation, please? So there are really elements to take into consideration when we want to bring mindfulness in a school. At the same time, in that same school, in the French school of Beijing, it was really hard to go beyond that, because it was really not the culture of the school. So there were limitations as well. And so now I work as the head of mindfulness in UWC Thailand that I mentioned earlier. I'm a wall school. I teach our students from kindergarten to grade 12, and with different modalities. Sometimes it's indoor. We have a mindfulness center for that, as you can see on the right side. And sometimes outdoor. And again, finding allies, finding partners. So on the left side, I'm partnering with our librarian. And we did a whole week of mindful reading, and all students from the school, including their parents, could join the workshop. And so this is the kind of innovation and creativity that is needed, and that really depends on who is willing to partner, who buys into mindfulness, and who is innovative and creative enough to try something new. And for adults, I train the staff, I train our parents, I also train the alumni of the UWC movements and also leaders. So here on the left, you can see we're doing a mindful hike in the jungle that is just close nearby the school. And on the right side, this is a mindful activity on the beach. We were doing beach cleaning, mindful beach cleaning with a group of alumni and leaders of the UWC movement that Dalida co-led with me, actually. So here the lesson is using our immediate environment. We are lucky enough to have that environment near the school, and using what's already happening in the school. Here we have outdoor education on the left, and on the right, as part of the IB program, there's CAS, community, and service and community, right? So here are some of my learnings in addition to what I just said. So a key question when we want to bring mindfulness to students and staff in school is that balance between mandatory and optional. So if you just start, of course, it will be optional. But at the same time, maybe you want also to consider to start a mandatory course. Because if it's only optional, chances are that people will not join unless you have a very charismatic and strong personality. Because you're asking people to slow down. And when people are not used to that, it can be really scary. So I would say it's a spectrum. You need to have some spaces where it's mandatory so people can have a taste of it. And then the possibility to join optional classes. So in my school, for example, we offer extracurricular activities where students can join the 8 weeks mindful self-compassion course, but they have mandatory 15 minutes every day with their homeroom teacher. Or in primary, they have a proper period in their week that they spend with me at the mindfulness center. And same for the staff, they have a training at the beginning of the year that is mandatory, and then it's optional for them to continue to join whatever we propose. Now, the 8 weeks curriculum skills-based mindfulness programs are outdated. By that, I mean, it doesn't mean that we should not use them, but once you have done it, you've done it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and you have students and staff who are interested in mindfulness. You cannot just serve them the program. Let's say the activity of eating a raisin in the MBSR program, it's a very didactic activity. Once you have done that once, you need to be able to be more creative and, for example, offer an activity where it's mindful eating at the canteen, so it's actually applied. And so that leads us to the next one. It needs to be relevant to our students. The more you can bring mindfulness in things that they're already doing, the more they will get it. For example, we did a workshop with grade 11 students, and we did a mindful studying. So they had 1 hour, and their teacher will ring the bell every 10 or 15 minutes. And when they hear the bell, the instruction was for them to pause, close their eyes, take a deep breath, and just checking with themselves where they're at. And do they need to drink some water? Do they need a stretch? Or maybe they choose to continue to study. So that's the difference between teaching a skill versus applying in their life, becoming a way of life. And that's the difference between teaching foundations of mindfulness versus applied mindfulness. Another aspect is that, especially with teenagers, there is a strong component about interacting with each other. And so it can be really interesting to think on how we move from an individual practice that is very Western-minded, mindfulness as a self-help practice. You're stressed, meditate, you're less stressed, into social mindfulness. How do we apply mindfulness to the way we relate to each other, communicate to each other? And there is a lot of work that is done on that. The whole field is evolving on that. And then be ready also to, or be open to use external help. So mentoring, finding inspiration and coaching. And I'm going to talk about coaching in a moment. We are halfway through, so I'm going to pause the video and just invite us to take a mindful moment. So just like I would do with students when they study, um, you may want to close your eyes or keep them open, gently open, and just doing whatever is needed for you to be present. So that could be taking a deep breath, or that could be sensing your feet on the floor, or feeling the weight of your body on the chair, or hearing the sounds in the room. Allowing this connection with yourself just for a moment. Maybe even want to feel your hands, the touch of your hands, the life in your hands. Perhaps I want to bring a smile on our face or in our mind, or nothing, just like that. Now, whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. Maybe you want to stretch your body, yawn, massage your face. Hmm. Look around, relax your eyes. All right. Welcome back. Hmm. So I share my screen again. As soon as I have found the right screen. Okay, there we go. Okay. So talking about mentoring, inspiration, and coaching. Um, Especially if we practice secular mindfulness, it's really important to go back to the roots of mindfulness. That's how I found my strengths to be creative with mindfulness with my students and staff, while at the same time being strong on the values and essence and principles of mindfulness. And so my North Star is Plant Village with with two main points. Number one, how the Sangha, the community, is at the core of the practice. And number two, the concept of applied mindfulness, that is a gentle or more polite or political acceptable way of talking about engaged Buddhism. On the bottom left, that's Dalida and I at the Thai Plant Village near Bangkok. We are so fortunate to live in Thailand and that we have access to the Plant Village here. And it felt really, I have arrived, I'm at home. That's really how it felt, to have a community that is supporting, where we can reset and get inspiration and go deeper into the practice. And I even found there is a monastic brother there who is in charge of developing mindfulness in schools. And from time, I have him on WhatsApp, and from time to time, I ask him a questions, and it takes him 3 days to answer because they don't use their phones that much. But having that kind of support is really, really important. It's a big task otherwise. And about coaching, I would like to share a little bit about it, in particular about my view on it and a pilot project that we started in the school where I work. So I call it Mindfulness-informed coaching for staff. So let's go back to coaching, the definition of coaching according to the ICF, the International Coaching Federation. So coaching is partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process to maximize their personal and professional potential. And that helps to untap sources of imagination, productivity, and leadership. And mindfulness is a set of principles, a set of practices, and all of that based on the ethics of compassion for all sentient beings, finding its essence in Buddhism. So how does mindfulness and coaching work together? So when they're combined, we bring together the principles and practice of mindfulness with the techniques, methodology, and ethics of coaching. And what is really important here is that it helps clients to transfer their mindfulness skills into diverse roles in their life, be it as a teacher, as a leader, a parent, a spouse. So remember how I say there's a sense of urgency, and we don't have time to wait for teachers to get trained so that they can train their students. And if we train their students but without training the teachers, it doesn't work either. So here is a model that was used by different organizations who advocate for mindfulness in schools, such as MindBee, there's Mindwell, Mindful Schools, and their motto was be mindful, teach mindfully, teach mindfulness. With the idea that first teachers need to have their practice, then they transfer their mindfulness skills in the way they teach, no matter what they teach, biology, math, whatever, and then they can teach mindfulness. So there's a problem with this model. Number one, it seems it's linear when in fact it's very messy. You try to bring mindfulness in your classroom and you realize that students is yawning all the time, and that one they're all talking to each other. You feel triggered and you think, oh my gosh, this doesn't work. You go back to your practice and you work on that sense of frustration and the gap between your aspiration and the reality. And then you ask for mentoring and then you go back again. So it's not linear. The second thing is that it's assumed that the transferring between our mindfulness practice and our different roles in life is a natural evolution. When in fact, maybe it will happen 10 years from now if you practice every day and you go on retreats every year. But it's not a given. In fact, there are people who practice, who I heard about this person who went for 1.5 years in a silent retreat. And when he came out of it, he was yelling at people. The transfer is not obvious, doesn't go that naturally. So why coaching? Coaching can really support our staff to transfer their mindfulness skills in their role. And so for that reason, we started a pilot project. We had five of our staff who took the foundation mindfulness course with me at the beginning of the school year and who volunteered to go through this pilot program from February to June. And so we matched them with five mindfulness coach from the BMC Academy. and who are on the way to get their ICF certification. So they were matched together, and together in pairs, they had up to 5 sessions. So some of them have finished, some of them are still doing it. And these are the first feedbacks from our projects. And I will just give you a bit of time to read. I'll read with you. So I was able to work through issues at work without involving anyone at work and find positive solutions for myself to be clear about my next steps. The best professional development ever because it's so personalized. It allowed me to give focused time to a situation and look at different perspectives rather than juggling everything in my head at once. I was heard on every level. My topic was on compassionate leadership. Through the coaching sessions, I realized that I needed compassion for myself. So this is really promising in terms of well-being of the staff, in terms of professional development, and in terms of transferring their mindfulness skills in their role. Because here those are both academic and non-academic staff, by the way. So I will pause here. I could share more, but I will pause here. This is my email address, my personal and professional. And I would like to take questions if there are any.
Julia, I'm very
I
curious.
think you're muted, Jerica.
Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you. Or is it me?
It's you. I can hear her. She's not muted.
You can't hear, but I can hear you, Davida. I cannot hear Jerica.
Okay, you can share, Viorica. I will. Maybe it's going to pick up. I will repeat the question for Julia.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Magic. I'm curious, how do you see your coaching program that you just mentioned that you implemented with your school? How do you see that evolving and maybe helping the greater school community at your school?
So for now, it's okay. So there is what I would love to, and there is the reality. So for the reality, I think it will just stay like that for at least next year. Just 4-5 people who are interested and 4-5 coaches. So I don't see the scope evolving much next year. And the reason for that is that there's still need for understanding in the school of so from the staff, not everyone understand the value, number one. And so for the staff to be clients, and number two, from the leadership team, an understanding also it's not just understanding of the value, but just the partnership, like how to partner with an external, like what would that mean? There are many questions to consider, like in terms of confidentiality and all of that. There's just not the habits of what is coaching and what does that mean to bring external people in the school to support the staff. So there's, I would say on my side, a lot of education to do, and that can take a long time, like maybe a few years. My vision, what I would love to, is that we have a proper partnership with, a mindfulness-informed coaching schools, and it's just the habits. There's a budget, coaches are hired, and it's just offered. It's something like as soon as new staff arrives in the school, when we talk about their well-being, when we talk about their professional development, this is the menu, it's part of it. You can choose to hire a coach for the entire year rather than spending I don't know how many dollars to fly and go to another city to attend yet another program. So that's how I would see it.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for your question.
Maybe I can ask, I know we talk a lot about this topic, but your personal vision about bringing coaching into classrooms. Where is it now? I mean, I could guess that it's also far from it being there, but is it more realistic that maybe just to share, I find that when it's for students, things happen much faster and much sooner than when it's for teachers. Sadly, I think that it's true in many schools. So do you think that coaching for teachers to apply it as a teaching approach in a way, to have a teacher as a coach stands better chance?
I think it's the same problem as with, or the same challenges as with mindfulness. So in the sense that it's about transferring. So, if you teach mindfulness to teachers, then you need to wait that there's that gap. So how do they transfer the skills? In the same way, by the time teachers have learned coachings, they have been coached, and then they can bring it to their classroom as a skill, it can take quite some time. But I know there are coaches and there are coaching school that focuses on coaching students. So, right, so they're just like you have mindfulness teachers who teach students, you have coaches who coach students. I would say that it's really it would really be relevant with the IB program because you have all this about the inquiry. So bringing more powerful questions. I mean, yes, I would love that all teachers have those coaching skills and then can coach their students. But yeah, I think that's a long way. Just as for mindfulness. I saw Charlene has a question. Yeah.
Perhaps some comments and actually a quick update, although I understand this is recorded, but it's okay. I think I'll make sure everything I feel comfortable being public. But anyways, back in 2019 when I started the coaching, I mentioned that I want to focus on academic coaching. So coaching students. So quick update, I should be having a cohort this summer. So a 4 to 6 doing group coaching, and so which is why I'm getting on this call again. So a couple of comments like, that I've learned through the years about coaching, because I think in the US right now, there's a booming, like, there are a lot of academic coaches, and most of them are actually teachers. They get burnt out at school. So there are some programs, as you say, like, coaching programs for teachers. And I noticed that, yes, it's a different set of skills. And so some of these coaching program for teachers, they kind of, the one that I've been following, they've been saying the experience is like it's hard to transfer or convert ICF model of coaching to teachers. It's hard because so they do actually, I find it like we do have to adjust, like even how do we do a coaching program for teachers. So there's a lot so there are a lot more frameworks, I find, because ICF, it's like, almost like, how do you coach a student? It's kind of like, okay, student centered and like, no agenda. But then for teachers to be able to be coaches, then they kind of have some middle ground. They provide a lot more framework, like, if this is the issue, they identify like, common challenges that students face. And it's almost like they have, if you this happens, then do this. And if not, like do A, B, C, and it's quite different from the ICF model. That's what I've discovered. But it seems to be like a kind of helping teachers to become more coaching oriented. Just a step towards that. Because otherwise it's like, with teachers being so busy, it's hard. So having more frameworks and more tools that teachers can use immediately in the classroom, I think that's something that coach particular has done. So yeah.
Thank you so much for the updates, and congratulations for
And
the
yeah,
cohorts that you're going
I
to
know.
coach.
So I'm actually going to speak with Keystone tomorrow with the
Okay.
parent. Isn't it funny, like coming full circle? But it's kind of, I'm exploring facing like those elite, highly competitive schools. How do you do mindfulness? So that's something that I would love to continue to finally be more active in that mindful school group, WeChat group that I was in. Anyways, thank you. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Maybe, yeah, but just one comment. I think maybe Charlene, you also mentioned what is happening in America. It's very important also to see which kind of like region we are really talking about. I think our experience is pretty much still focused on Asia. Coaching is not so present here in Thailand, even in China, still quite new market. So it's really good to look into the UK, Europe, and America and see what's been done there. Thanks. Go ahead, Jörg.
If I may follow up from what Charlene said about coaching, and about teachers being coaches. I don't have much information about this, but last year I met a teacher at a PD who said that their school had organized an optional course for teachers to learn how to coach each other.
Oh, wow.
And so I don't know if there was mindfulness involved, but those who were, and this teacher attended the course, and he said that coming back to school, the teachers were helping each other, overcome challenges, solve problems. And maybe it cannot be the ICF model, or it cannot be, mindfulness coaching right from the beginning. But yes, perhaps an optional course for teachers to help each other, because there's one head of mindfulness in the school, right? But if teachers can be that support for each other, perhaps that can be one way of starting.
Yeah. Totally. I think peer coaching will be amazing. And yeah, I see it more easily put in place for staff for some reasons than for students. I mean, like from Charlene, what you just shared, it seems academic coach are mostly external, right? Whereas internal,
It's both. They have some, like I think that program is geared towards external coaches. But at the same time, she also tries to some of the teachers who are still teaching at schools want to learn these skills.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
And
All right.
talking and sharing just a really quick, like I think I may have mentioned, like, from the US, like, because I'm more researching what the US people are doing right now. My boarding school, Middlesex, like they've really done, I think they're one of the forerunners in like creating a mindfulness program. And every new student who enters the school will have to actually participate in 10-week 40-minute course on like MBSR. But it's also because actually the school itself, like, in the, like, John Kabat-Zinn actually sent the kids to this school. So, like, the school itself has the culture. So it was very open. I remember talking with the head of school who brought in this program, I think started in 2010, around 2010. And so I remember talking to the head of school, how they were able to implement at such a deep and school-wide level. And she said, this just, you have to bake it in the whole school culture, the calendar, and they're able to do that. And it seems like the students have always, I hear from many students, saying this program just changed my life. Like, really help with the stress management. But the one comment, right, like, as I go through that, the page, they have a Middlesex, they have a mindfulness program, and they share these best practices. But the way that they really pitch or like position mindfulness is really about, stress management, better sleep, better focus, focus in sports. Yeah, and so it's very performance focus. And I think that's part of the reason why they're able to do such a program, because otherwise it's kind of bridging the gap, meetings like the public, what general public view, like, they are still a very elite school with a lot of pressure to perform, and that's how they position the program so that it can still be something done. So that's one approach that they've done. And I'm also kind of still kind of figuring out. I think in my program, I'm not saying anything about self-compassion or mindfulness. And we'll see. I'm testing. We'll see how it works.
It's interesting that you mentioned Middlesex, because I was reading recently, and I read the whole history of the mindfulness programming. And one thing that is also very interesting to note is that the person who started, the director of mindfulness is still the same who started in 2010. So he's been there for 14 years. And that's something that I think makes a huge difference. So like in my case, I mean, in the case of the school where I work, it's an international school, which means a lot of turnover. And each time the person leaves, the thing is that it's such a niche. There's no network. Like I don't know many directors of mindfulness. There are just a few. And so you don't have professional development organized by the IB form directors of mindfulness. That doesn't exist. So you have to find your own way. And so what I think is that that person grows with, the program grows with the person. So the director of mindfulness at Middlesex, he started little, he started small. He started with one group of students, and then he tweaked the program, and then it really works. And then he added other groups of students, and then he tried with the staff, and then until it works, and then he tried with the parents until parents buys it, and then and then it became big. And then at some point he realized his practice is not deep enough. He cannot answer the questions. So he paused. He took 3 months off to go to a retreat and then came back. So he grew, means his practice grew, his capacity to take on grew with the school, right? What is, I think, is very difficult to take over someone who left, someone who grew, and to take this wide school, whole school, without having grown with the position. That's where I'm at. So I'm just realizing all of that. And every time the person leaves, the school take 2 or 3 steps backwards, because there's just not enough people trained to be a director of mindfulness, So I think that what Middlesex also has been successful with is to keep that one person and to keep growing, 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 growing.
And it's also, I mean, that's why I say like the school, the culture, because actually he is an alum. He used to study there. So everyone is just so mindful minded, which is very rare. And I do remember him also saying, sharing his best practice, that he targeted the top of the high school community, which is in American boarding school, it's the jocks, like the athletics. Like once they
Right.
get the people at the top level, in terms of students resistance, but like, you know, everyone just practice. So it was one of his key. That's what he said. But anyway, it's not really, I mean, what I hear from you is that the students are open.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah,
community is
it's
open.
yeah,
That's
the
that's absolutely for
but it's more
sure.
like the school administration that needs a lot more, like, you know, senior buy-in, or like really that whole culture.
Mhm. There is buying. It's not the issue. I think it's more in order to really know what the school needs, you know, like it takes a
Mm.
lot. I think I'm really talking about myself, really. Like it took me 1 year to understand how things work in the school. And then because we cannot just come in with the 8 weeks program, because we have to be creative and adaptive and flexible and hear the needs, and that takes time, right? To understand what those primary school student needs and those high schoolers needs. And when I say those, I mean the ones in this particular situation, in this school, in this country, in this system, and understanding what those parents need and what those leadership think. It's just so wide by the time, you know, the time to understand the culture. And because we need to adapt, we cannot just take a curriculum and put it on the school. So that's the challenge. The buy-in is there, no problem. Um, but the role in itself has challenges in it. But thank you for, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. You know, because I just met with an education consultant whom I've been working for many years. And again, the needs, I mean, that's a great reminder for me to really understand the needs. I think that's my key takeaway. It takes time.
Yeah.
And every student is different. Every family is different. But I think over time, and I'm still at the really beginning of understanding. I think I need to kind of almost build a profile for the typical type of family who have different needs, and so that I can adjust the communication accordingly. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, on that
All
note,
right.
it's on the top of the hour. I think this is a topic that I believe 3-4 months from now we could have another check-in and be updated with yet another twist of events. One thing that I think Julia didn't mention is that she held a retreat for DP students as well. So for a 3 days a retreat, and that is really new thing also. And I think there was a really, and it was by choice. So and there's some really, really amazing projects that are happening there, and it's inspiring to hear.
I just finished to train to give a 6 weeks training for the sport coaches, and that was the first time it was ever done in this at the school. So those are kind of innovations, right? The retreat also was never done, and it was a project that was, you know, it fell flat because of COVID. There's all those being creative and innovative.
And I know that Viorica, you were quite engaged in the realm of educating teachers on self-care and well-being, and bringing some talks in the schools. So it's just wonderful to see everyone here. And we know that it is about students, but also what I'm hearing in some of the research that Julia's school is involved with Harvard University, that it's really teachers are the key element in the well-being of the school as well. It cannot be put on the side. So much more, a lot to be done. And Julia, thank you so much for such a thorough sharing of your experience. Not many have capacity to be in that role specifically internally. And again, let's continue to have this conversation and keep it rolling. Very important topic. So thank you all, and
Thank you
enjoy
very
the rest
much.
of the evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.